Around the World Lit Audio. Candide by Voltaire. Episode 1. Chapters 1 to 6. Full narration script. Channel intro. Welcome to Around the World Lit Audio, the greatest novels ever written, from every corner of the world, in English. New chapter every week. Free to listen. Series introduction. Today we begin a new book, Candide, by Voltaire, published in France in 1759. One of the most savage, most funny, most relentlessly readable books ever written. It is a philosophical tale, or rather, it is a philosophical argument disguised as an adventure story, in which Voltaire takes the most optimistic idea of his century and dismantles it, chapter by chapter, with the focused enthusiasm of a man who has had enough. The idea he is dismantling belongs to the philosopher Leibniz, who argued that God, being perfect, could only have created the best of all possible worlds, that everything that happens, however terrible it appears, is part of a divine plan, that is, in its totality, good. This is the philosophy of optimism in its purest form. Voltaire found it, to put it mildly, unconvincing. He had recently witnessed the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which killed between 30 and 60,000 people in 6 minutes on All Saints' Day while the churches were full. He thought Leibniz had some explaining to do. What he wrote in response is 30 chapters long, and takes approximately 4 hours to read. It contains wars, earthquakes, inquisitions, shipwrecks, slavery, pirates, and a great deal of philosophy, delivered at extremely high speed by characters, who are either catastrophically naive or catastrophically cynical, and who are usually both simultaneously. It is, by any measure, a masterpiece. Episode 1. Chapters 1 through 6. Chapter 1. How Candide was brought up in a fine castle, and how he was driven from thence. In the country of Westphalia, in the castle of the most noble Baron Thunder-ten-tronckh, there lived a young man on whom nature had bestowed the most agreeable manners. His name was Candide. He was the illegitimate nephew of the Baron, or possibly not the nephew, exactly, the family connection being somewhat disputed, but he lived in the castle and was treated with the tolerance that powerful families extend to their slightly ambiguous dependents. He was gentle, he was honest, he had a face that expressed his soul, which was simple and straightforward and entirely without guile. Which is to say, he was the kind of person who believes what he is told. What he was told, primarily, was told to him by his tutor. The tutor's name was Pangloss, and Pangloss was a philosopher of the school of metaphysico-theologo-cosmology, which is to say he believed, with complete conviction and considerable eloquence, that everything in the world was arranged for the best. This was self-evidently true, he explained to Candide, because things could not be otherwise. Noses were made to support spectacles, therefore we have spectacles. Legs were clearly designed for breeches, therefore we have breeches. Stones were formed to be cut into castles, therefore the Baron had a fine castle. The greatest of barons must be the best lodged in the best of all possible worlds. Candide listened to this with complete attention, and believed every word of it, because Pangloss said it convincingly, and because Candide had not yet had any experience that contradicted it. The castle itself seemed to support the argument. It had a door and windows. The Baron weighed 350 pounds, which was considered in Westphalia to be a mark of great dignity. The Baroness, his wife, was worthy of her husband in every respect. Their daughter Cunigund was 17 years old, rosy-cheeked, fresh, plump, and desirable. The Baron's son appeared in all respects worthy of his father. Candide, observing all of this from his position of comfortable ambiguity, concluded that it was indeed the best of all possible castles, and that the Baron was the greatest of possible barons. One day Cunigund, walking near the castle, observed Dr. Pangloss giving a lesson in experimental physics to her mother's chambermaid, a small brown girl, very pretty and very willing. The lesson was conducted with great thoroughness. Cunigund, who was scientifically curious, returned home very much enlightened and thoughtful, and very desirous of receiving instruction herself. She encountered Candide on her way back. Candide encountered Cunigund. Their eyes met. They blushed. They did not speak. Their hands touched, apparently by accident. The effect of this on Candide was immediate and comprehensive. He concluded, in the manner of someone who has recently been educated about experimental physics, that this was indeed the best of all possible worlds, and that Cunigund was the finest specimen in it. The Baron, happening to walk past at this precise moment, observed Candide and his daughter in a situation that, while not technically improper, was suggestive enough that a man of the Baron's dignity felt compelled to act. He acted. He kicked Candide out of the castle with considerable force. Candide, bewildered, walked for some time through the snow, reflecting on what had happened. He concluded that he had been expelled from the most beautiful of all possible castles, for the most beautiful of all possible reasons. He was hungry and cold. He sat down in a field. Snow fell on him. He had no money. He had no plan. He had Pangloss' philosophy, which assured him that all was well. He was not entirely certain all was well. Chapter 2. What became of Candide among the Bulgarians? Candide, shivering and starving, walked to the nearest town, which was called Waldberghof-Trarbk-Dickdorf, and sat in the doorway of an inn looking extremely cold and extremely sad, which is to say he looked like someone in need of something. 2 soldiers found him there. They were large and well fed, in the uniforms of the Bulgarian army, and they looked at Candide with the professional assessment of men who recognize useful material. They told him he looked like a fine young man of exactly the right height. They bought him dinner. They gave him money. They explained that all he was required to do in return was serve the king of Bulgaria. Candide, who had never been given money before without any apparent obligation attached, was delighted. They asked him if he loved the king of Bulgaria. He said yes, because he had never met the king of Bulgaria and had no reason not to love him. They told him he was a hero and a defender of the faith, and took him immediately to the regiment. He was made to turn right, turn left, draw his rammer, return his rammer, present arms, slope arms, march forward, march backward, at a rate of execution that left no time for the reflection that might have led him to reconsider. When he tried to walk away, which he did one afternoon because it seemed reasonable that a person should be free to go wherever they wished, he was caught by 4 soldiers and brought before a court-martial, which gave him the choice of being beaten 36 times by the whole regiment, or receiving 12 musket balls in the brain. He chose the beating, having been told by Pangloss that the human will is free. He survived 2 rounds of the flogging before the king of Bulgaria, who happened to be passing, was moved by his innocent face to pardon him. Candide's wounds healed. He had survived. He concluded, with the help of Pangloss' philosophy, that this was entirely consistent with the best of all possible worlds, though he noted privately that he had perhaps not fully understood what a beating felt like until now. Chapter 3. How Candide made his escape from the Bulgarians, and what afterwards happened to him. The Bulgarians went to war with the Avars. War, as Voltaire describes it, is a beautiful thing. It begins with the 2 armies drawing themselves up in perfect order, drums and trumpets making the most harmonious music. Then each side fires 12,000 shots, which clears the best of all possible worlds of approximately 9 or 10,000 scoundrels. Then the bayonets serve as a further sufficient reason for the death of some thousands. The total number of those who have been saved from this best of all possible worlds amounts, on each side, to perhaps 30,000 souls. Candide, not being a soldier by temperament, hid himself while this was happening, and then walked through the ruins of what had recently been 2 villages. Noting that the children who had not been burned were dying of their wounds, the women who were not dead were finishing the dying process, and the old men who had survived were looking at what remained of their houses with the expression of people who can no longer be surprised by anything. He walked through this landscape at considerable speed, stopping only when he reached Holland, which was a country known for its religious tolerance and its wealth, and where he hoped to find something to eat. He encountered a man who had just preached a great sermon about charity and the love of one's neighbor. Candide asked this man for bread. The man asked if Candide believed the Pope to be the Antichrist. Candide said he wasn't sure. The man refused him bread. A woman standing nearby poured the contents of a chamber pot over Candide's head. He stood in the street, wet and without bread, and concluded that this was not quite what he had been expecting from a country of charitable Christians. Then a man named James, a Quaker and an Anabaptist, saw him and took him home, and dried him and fed him, and gave him money, and Candide thought that perhaps Pangloss had been right after all. Chapter 4. How Candide found his old master Pangloss again. The next day, walking through the town, Candide encountered a beggar covered in scabs, his eyes sunk in his head, his nose eaten away, his mouth drawn to one side, his teeth black, speaking with difficulty, tormented with a violent cough. This was Pangloss. Candide was horrified. He gave Pangloss money. He brought him to the Anabaptist James' house. When Pangloss had eaten something, he explained his condition. Cunigund was dead, he said. The Bulgarian soldiers had arrived at the castle. They had killed the Baron. They had killed the Baroness. They had killed Cunigund. Not before treating her with the thoroughness that soldiers in the best of all possible worlds sometimes display. The castle was burned to the ground. Candide wept. Then he asked how Pangloss came to be in such a state. Pangloss explained that it was love, specifically. Love acquired from the chambermaid Paquette, who had acquired it from a learned Franciscan, who had acquired it from an old countess, who had acquired it from a cavalry captain, who had acquired it from a marchioness, who had acquired it from a page, who had received it as a gift from a Jesuit, who in his novitiate had received it in a direct line from one of the companions of Christopher Columbus. He said all of this without any particular distress, because it was, after all, an indispensable component of the best of all possible worlds. Columbus had brought sugar, cocoa, and syphilis from the Americas. You could not have the sugar and cocoa without the syphilis. It was necessary. It was part of the plan. Candide listened to this argument and said, "That is a very odd kind of necessity." He asked whether there was a cure. There was no cure, Pangloss said. He had been given treatment by a barber who was also a monk. The treatment was not quite a cure, he said, producing a tooth from his pocket which he had lost in the process. Candide, who was now paying for Pangloss' treatment, arranged for the Anabaptist James to employ them both. They embarked for Lisbon on James' business. On the voyage they encountered a storm. Chapter 5, Tempest, Shipwreck, Earthquake, and what happened to Dr. Pangloss, Candide, and James the Anabaptist. The storm was thorough. James the Anabaptist fell into the sea while helping a sailor. The sailor, whom James had just saved, walked past without looking at him. Pangloss prevented Candide from jumping in after James by proving to him that the Bay of Lisbon had been made on purpose for the Anabaptist to drown in. James drowned. The ship was wrecked. They reached the shore. Pangloss and Candide survived. The ground was still trembling. The earthquake of Lisbon had killed 30,000 inhabitants. Pangloss considered the best means of reassuring everyone that all was well. This was necessary, he felt, because the evidence required some reassurance. He began to explain to the survivors, who were sitting in the rubble looking at what had been their city, that this was the best of all possible earthquakes, in the best of all possible worlds, and that the destruction of Lisbon was necessitated by a chain of causality proceeding from original causes, and that free will was perfectly reconcilable with divine providence, and that the rubble they were sitting in was precisely the rubble they needed to be sitting in. Some of the survivors listened. Some of them looked at the rubble. Candide, who had been injured when the earthquake began, a stone having fallen on him, was bleeding and asking for oil and wine, because he thought he might be dying. Pangloss brought him water. Chapter 6, How a fine auto-da-fe was celebrated to prevent earthquakes, and how Candide was flogged. The wise men of the University of Coimbra, having considered the matter, concluded that the best way to prevent future earthquakes was to give the people a fine spectacle. An auto-da-fe is a ceremony of faith, specifically, a ceremony in which the Inquisition burns or otherwise punishes those whose faith is insufficiently orthodox. The wise men concluded that if they burned a few people, in a slow fire with great ceremony, the ground would certainly stop shaking. They were thoughtful about who to choose. A man who had married his godmother was selected. Two Portuguese who had removed the bacon from their chicken were included, which suggested Jewish dietary practices. Pangloss was taken for speaking, and Candide for listening with an air of approbation. The ceremony was conducted with great poignancy. Pangloss was hanged, because burning would have been inconsistent with his particular offense under the relevant regulations. Candide was flogged in time with the music. When it was over, the earth shook again with tremendous violence. Candide, beaten and bleeding, muttered to himself, "If this is the best of all possible worlds, what are the others?" A bent old woman approached him. She said, "Courage, my son, follow me." Chapter Transition. You have reached the end of episode 1 of Candide, by Voltaire. Chapters 1 through 6. Pangloss has been hanged. Candide has been flogged. Cunegonde is dead, or at least, she has been reported dead, which in the best of all possible novels, is not quite the same thing. A bent old woman is leading Candide somewhere. And Voltaire has barely started. Episode 2 is available next week. Subscribe to Around the World Lit Audio so you never miss a chapter. A new episode arrives every week.